It started as a whisper, a rumor moving through Los Angeles County's most crowded cell blocks, quiet, cautious, but deadly in implication. Word was the Mexican Mafia had issued a green light. In that world, a green light didn't mean permission, it meant target. It meant that certain gangs, certain individuals, once protected under the blue and white umbrella of the Sureños, were now fair game. No warning, no debate. By the early 1990s, Los Angeles was a city already divided by concrete and code. Street corners doubled as borderlines. Alleys could be the difference between safe passage and no return. For decades, the Sereno identity had linked hundreds of Southern California neighborhoods under one loose banner, united by geography, not necessarily loyalty, but the order that spread through the jails that year would shatter that illusion of unity for good. At first, the rumor didn't sound real. How could the same force that demanded unity among Southern California gangs now be turning its power inward? But as the weeks passed, reality bled through the rumor mill. The order came from high up, and it was serious. Inside the walls, the tension was immediate. Small disputes escalated overnight. Alliances built over years started to splinter, and when some of the first paroled members walked out of the jail system and returned to their neighborhoods, they carried that same paranoia with them, spreading it like wildfire. Whispers turned into warnings, warnings turned into action. Sureños began watching each other more than their rivals. By the end of that year, one truth was clear. The streets and the cells were no longer separate worlds. The same code of control that ruled behind the walls now ruled the city. And the green light wasn't just punishment anymore. It was a weapon, used to keep people in line through fear. For decades, La M.A. ruled Southern California through fear, taxes, and intimidation. Every Sereno set, from Harbor City to the Valley, knew the rules. Pay your cut, follow your shot caller, and never question an order from the prison hierarchy. The system worked like a business pyramid. At the top sat imprisoned EMA members controlling money and violence through coded kites and visiting room whispers. Below them, trusted soldiers and tax collectors enforced tribute from local neighborhoods. Drug profits, robbery splits, even protection money from the streets. Despite the blue bandana under one flag, the Sureños were never a single gang. They were hundreds of barrios, each independent, united only by fear of the same overseer. Whenever a clique disrespected the chain, missed taxes, refused orders, or questioned authority, it earned a green light. That word meant on site, no discussion, no politics. Inside L.A. County Jail, these orders were more than rumors. They were written down. Deputies intercepted handwritten roll-up lists passed cell to cell, listing the condemned. One of the most infamous surfaced in the early 1990s, a lined notebook sheet labeled Rollup Los Verdes. That list included Lowell Street Locos, Opal Street Locos, Playboys 13, and several Maravilla cliques, sets accused of refusing taxes or disrespecting MA representatives. Copies were found under bunks, taped behind mirrors, hidden in legal folders, and rewritten countless times so they could circulate without being seized. A veteran jail investigator said, "When that list dropped, the whole module flipped overnight. Friends stopped walking together." That wasn't myth, it was written policy. And when those names leaked from the jail into East L.A. streets, it lit the fuse for one of the most violent internal wars the Sureños had ever faced. By the early 1990s, the Mexican Mafia had gone from a prison-based brotherhood to a structured criminal organization. Through coded messages, La M.A. began enforcing a new street policy. All Sureño gangs under its umbrella would now pay taxes on local hustles, from drug profits to robbery money, as a sign of loyalty. In 1993, La M.A. leadership began holding meetings to implement the taxation system and promote what they called a mandatory peace agreement between rival Sureño gangs. On paper, it was meant to stop neighborhood wars. In reality, it was about control. During one of those meetings, members of Lopez Maravilla stood their ground. They refused to pay taxes to La M.A., openly challenging the Mafia's authority. That decision made them the first Maravilla clique to be officially green-lighted. Within weeks, the rest of the Maravilla cliques, Ford, Arizona, Gage, and others, followed the same path. Their refusal united them not just in name, but in defiance. The consequences were severe. Inside L.A. County Jail, Maravilla members were targeted relentlessly by other Sureño gangs following La M's orders. To prevent constant attacks, jail officials began housing Maravilla inmates separately, effectively isolating them from the general Sureño population, a separation that continues in many facilities to this day. When the first green-lighted Maravilla members paroled out, the violence didn't stay contained behind bars. East Los Angeles. City Terrace, First Street, Mednick Avenue, and Ford Boulevard became a war zone. Reports from the early 1990s describe a string of ambushes and drive-by shootings between Maravilla cliques and Sereno sets loyal to La. Witnesses told investigators that attackers shouted "green light" before opening fire. Sheriff's logs from that period tied multiple incidents to what they called AIM enforcement, but the outcome wasn't one-sided. Maravilla fought back hard. Members from Ford, Lopez, Arizona, and Gage Maravilla organized their own retaliations against anyone carrying out mafia orders. A longtime gang investigator said, "They were tearing up anyone who came into their zone. They fought the system inside and out." So in other words, Maravilla was putting belt to ass at the expense of the Mexican Mafia. For months, East L.A. residents heard nightly gunfire echoing through the low hills of City Terrace. Even after major 1994 sheriff's sweeps along Ford Boulevard and Brooklyn Avenue, the feud refused to die. By 1995, county intelligence units officially described it as a civil war among Southside gangs. Dozens were hospitalized, others never made it home. Yet in those barrios around First Street, Maravilla's defiance became legend, the few who stood up to La M and survived. The rebellion didn't stop in East L.A. It spread east toward the hills of El Sereno and the dense blocks of Boyle Heights, where two more neighborhoods drew the line against the Mexican Mafia. Lowell Street Locos, active in El Sereno since the early 1980s, had grown up in the shadow of larger sets like El Sereno 13 and Barrio Nuevo Estrada. But by the early 1990s, they weren't taking orders from anyone. An LAPD gang summary and multiple media reports, including a 1997 Fox 11 undercover segment, confirmed that Lowell Street was already resisting the Mexican Mafia's taxation system by 1992. When La Aim's collectors came demanding tribute on behalf of El Sereno Rifa, Lowell Street refused. In the middle of that war came one of the most infamous moments in El Sereno's history. Antonio Tonito Rodriguez, the Mexican Mafia's appointed tax collector for the El Sereno corridor, had a reputation for intimidation, but Lowell Street had zero respect for him. By spring 1995, things in El Sereno reached a breaking point. La M's local tax collector, a man known on the streets as Tonito, had been pressuring Lowell Street to fall in line. They didn't just ignore him, they made a statement. One night, gunfire tore through a parked vehicle on a side street off Huntington Drive. Tonito was hit multiple times, slumping over the steering wheel before responders even arrived. Investigators later tied the shooting to a young Lowell Street member, barely 19, said to have emptied a whole clip into the car. La M wanted blood in return. 3 months later, a 1981 Cadillac was ambushed in nearby Lincoln Heights. The suspected shooter from the Tonito case was struck and killed instantly. Another passenger was left paralyzed, and a third wounded. Witnesses reported the gunman yelling,
"Hey, you vatos got a green light out. This is for Tonito,"
before firing every round from his 9mm pistol. Authorities later identified the shooter only as gangster Javier Marquez, who was eventually sentenced to life without parole. Across the river in Boyle Heights near the Santa Ana Freeway, the Opal Street Locos, another independent clique dating back to the early 1980s, faced the same pressure. La Aim's tax collectors wanted a cut of everything moving through Whittier Boulevard and the alleys off Opal Street. When they refused, they joined Lowell on the list. According to StreetGangs.com and United Gangs, Opal Street's position was simple: no taxes, no tribute, no control. That stance came with a price. Members were targeted in jail, and their home turf on Whittier became a no-go zone for outsiders. Shootings near Euclid Avenue and the 6th Street Bridge were logged as part of the fallout. Yet neither hood folded. A veteran Hollenbeck officer later said, "Those little crews fought like they had nothing to lose." By the mid-1990s, both Lowell and Opal were fully green-lighted. They faced raids, indictments, and shootouts, but never aligned with La M. By the early 2000s, Opal's numbers had dwindled. Its members scattered after repeated crackdowns by LAPD and joint federal task forces. Their independence had left them isolated, but it also made them legend in Boyle Heights, one of the few barrios that refused to bend. In the legend of the Greenlight Era, Lowell Street and Opal Street became symbols of small hood rebellion, tight neighborhoods that refused to pay tribute even when the empire came knocking. By 1995, the street green lights had evolved into a full-scale internal segregation policy. Inside the Los Angeles County jail system, Maravilla, Lowell Street Locos, and Opal Street Locos were now classified as no good to Sureños under Laim's authority. The jail's gang intelligence unit began listing them under green light status, separating them from the general Sereno population to reduce constant assaults. Between 1995 and 1999, multiple documented stabbings occurred in Men's Central Jail, involving Maravilla inmates targeted by IME-aligned Sureños. Sheriff's Department logs from those years show that IME enforcement assaults were among the leading causes of lockdowns in modules 2,700 and 3,300. The attacks often took place during movements to chow or court, prompting deputies to create an unofficial Maravilla tank. Lowell and Opal members, both small numbers but sharing the same green light, were housed alongside Maravilla to prevent further assaults. In early 1996, a riot inside Men's Central Jail left over a dozen inmates injured after Sureños aligned with La M.A. attacked a group of Maravilla and independent Latino inmates in the exercise yard. A year later, in 1997, the newly opened Twin Towers Correctional Facility documented its first gang-related disturbance between IME loyalists and inmates identified as no good. Reports describe homemade weapons, broom handle shanks, and hot water assaults used during these fights. Sheriff's investigators attributed nearly all of these incidents to enforcement of ongoing green lights. Sheriff's Department and the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, began formally tracking green-lighted gangs under the Security Threat Group designation. The database listed dozens of smaller barrios that refused mafia taxation, among them Lopez, Ford, Arizona, and Gage Maravilla, as well as Lowell Street and Opal Street Locos. In 2001, a major incident inside Men's Central Jail drew media attention after a brawl between Maravilla and 18th Street inmates left 3 hospitalized and forced a full lockdown of 5 modules. 2 years later, in 2003, an East Los Angeles gang sweep by LASD's Operation Safe Streets targeted parole violators tied to Maravilla cliques still resisting mafia control. Over 30 arrests were made, confirming that the feud had migrated from jail cells back onto East L.A. streets. During this period, Maravilla, Lowell, and Opal members were consistently classified as separatee inmates within L.A. County and state facilities. Inside Men's Central Jail and the California prison system, they were prohibited from mixing with Sureños. Correctional officers' incident summaries described that when mistakenly housed together, fights broke out within minutes. Reports from 2005 to 2006 show that small alliances occasionally formed between green-lighted Latino groups and non-affiliated or black inmates to survive assaults in shared modules. By 2007, the CDCR officially documented Maravilla modules within reception centers such as Wasco and Delano, noting them as non-programming, non-IME affiliates. By 2008, internal intelligence confirmed that the original purpose of the green light, discipline and taxation enforcement, had become a permanent structural divide in the Southern California prison system. The Los Angeles County Jail maintained Maravilla and related barrios in isolated housing. Some Maravilla parolees who re-entered the system decades later still carried the same classification code from the 1990s. Do not house with Sur. Although the overt violence slowed, the political separation never healed. Every new generation of Maravilla, Lowell, or Opal member inherited the same status, outsiders among their own kind. The county jail wars had turned a temporary green light into a lasting boundary inside California's carceral landscape. By 2008, Los Angeles County's jail system had stabilized the physical violence, but not the distrust. The green light orders that began as discipline had evolved into a psychological control mechanism, reaching from prison yards to the streets of East L.A. and El Sereno. Once Laim's taxation and disciplinary structure became public record through multiple RICO trials, the threat of being green-lighted turned into a tool of silent enforcement. Inmates no longer had to see violence to feel its reach. Rumors alone could end alliances. CDCR gang coordinators reported that even unaffiliated inmates feared being listed, a term used to describe inclusion on informal hit lists. Streetside, this culture of suspicion mirrored the institutional one. Young Sureño recruits were warned to check paperwork before trusting anyone. Old barrios that had long paid taxes began conducting their own internal audits, terrified of harboring informants or no goods. Fear replaced loyalty as the dominant form of governance. The 2012 federal indictment known as Operation Black Flag revealed how LAM used green lights to control not only gangs, but also jail economics, from store taxes to contraband markets. This period saw dozens of internal removals ordered without physical meetings, proof that reputation now carried the same weight as violence. Sheriff's intelligence reports noted that many younger Sureños no longer understood the original reasons behind old green lights. They obeyed out of habit and fear. Groups, Maravilla, Lowell Street Locos, and Opal Street Locos, continued serving time under permanent separation codes. Parole officers documented how former members of those barrios were denied protective custody placement because their status had become normalized. Neither allies nor active enemies, simply outsiders. As technology entered jail systems, surveillance cameras and inmate tracking reduced open assaults, but the political structure stayed intact. Interviews with ex-inmates during this era describe how the fear of internal punishment persisted even in lower security yards. Being labeled disloyal could isolate an inmate more effectively than violence ever did. On the streets, multi-agency gang injunctions, originally created to reduce shootings, ended up reinforcing those same internal divisions. Law enforcement mapping showed that several East L.A. neighborhoods still reflected old political lines. Sur-controlled zones and independent pockets where Maravilla or Lowell families continued to live apart. By the 2020s, LAM's direct influence had diminished through repeated federal prosecutions, but the culture of fear it built remained embedded in Sereno identity. Prison data still lists Maravilla as non-MA affiliated, and CDCR classification policy continues to separate them from the general Sureño population. Younger generations often inherit the same labels without understanding the history behind them. Sociology now describes the Greenlight Era as a case study in coercive governance, a system where compliance was achieved not through constant violence, but through the memory of it. The code survived its creators. One retired gang investigator told the Los Angeles Times in 2022, "They built a government out of fear, and it still runs without them. Even decades after the first orders were handed down, the shadow of the green light still lingers." What began as a disciplinary policy inside prison walls reshaped generations of Southern California gangs, especially those that dared to defy it. LAM's original goal in the early 1990s was control, taxation, structure, and obedience. But once the green light spread beyond the walls of Folsom, Pelican Bay, and Men's Central Jail, it became more than punishment. It evolved into a doctrine, a reminder that in this world, one order could turn friend against friend. Every time a gang refused to pay taxes or questioned authority, the memory of Maravilla's rebellion loomed as a warning. By the mid-2000s, entire neighborhoods had absorbed that lesson. Some sets, once proud to be Sureño, opted for quiet neutrality, keeping their heads low and their taxes paid. Others, like the Maravilla cliques, Lowell Street Locos and Opal Street Locos, held their ground, forever branded as outsiders. In the CDCR database, their non-EAM affiliated tag remains, passed down like a family name. Younger generations who never lived through the Greenlight years still inherit its language. Inside lockups, checking paperwork, and being cleared are everyday phrases. On the streets, stories of those who resisted, Lopez Maravilla refusing to bow, Lowell Street gunning back, Opal Street holding its line in Boyle Heights, have turned into urban folklore. In East L.A., those tales carry both pride and caution. Pride in standing apart, and caution in what it cost. Even today, sporadic altercations between old independent barrios and MA-aligned Sureños still trace back to that original fracture. The violence isn't constant, but the division is permanent. Prison culture described the Greenlight as one of the longest-lasting internal control systems in U.S. gang history. It taught tens of thousands of men to self-regulate out of fear, to obey without ever meeting their commanders. And for those who resisted, it became a badge of identity, a line they refused to cross even when it meant isolation. They tried to break them, said one retired LASD sergeant who served in East L.A. during the 1990s. Instead, they created something else, independent gangs that built their own code. The official green light orders may have faded from the yards, but the mindset remains. Even now, when a young recruit asks about Maravilla, someone always says the same thing. They didn't fold, they fought everybody, and that's how the legend survives. Not in graffiti or headlines, but in the unspoken rule that power, once abused, always leaves a scar. That's the full breakdown. I would ask you to please like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell for notifications. More stories coming soon. Until then, watch your step and respect the streets.